What if the person who always seems to suffer isn't choosing helplessness, but has genuinely forgotten they ever had a choice? Victim mentality is a term that gets weaponized constantly. Behavioral science draws a careful line, though, between the performance of helplessness and the deeply internalized belief that agency is simply impossible for you. That belief has a name: learned helplessness. Psychologist Martin Seligman coined the term in 1967 after experiments in which dogs exposed to inescapable electric shocks eventually stopped trying to escape, even when escape became possible. The nervous system had learned that effort was futile. It held on to that lesson long after the conditions changed. Behavioral scientists study how environments, relationships, and repeated experiences quietly shape the beliefs people carry about themselves. Victim mentality is rarely chosen. It's calibrated by circumstance over time. For many people, this calibration begins early. A child raised in an unpredictable environment, where outcomes feel random regardless of behavior, learns at a nervous system level that control is something others have, but they don't. Here's where the common assumption fractures. Most people encounter someone who always plays the victim and conclude manipulation. Conscious, deliberate, cynical. Psychological research consistently shows the picture is far more complicated than that. One of the unsettling findings of modern psychology is that we often don't know why we do what we do. A person operating from learned helplessness isn't running a conscious script. The helplessness feels real, because neurologically, it is. What does this look like from the outside? Persistent attribution of failure to external forces. Difficulty accepting that personal choices carry weight. A reflexive return to suffering as the most familiar emotional territory available. Here's where it gets harder. Victim orientation is often socially reinforced. Expressing suffering reliably draws comfort, attention, and relief from responsibility. The nervous system learns this works, and so the pattern deepens. When helplessness is rewarded with sympathy, reduced expectations, or exemption from accountability, the incentive structure actively discourages growth, even when growth is desired. The path of least resistance runs straight through suffering. Culture shapes this further. Scholar Hazel Rose Marcus has spent decades demonstrating how culture and psychology interact, how the stories a society tells about suffering, agency, and identity become the stories individuals tell about themselves. Each time someone attributes an outcome to forces beyond their control, self-efficacy erodes slightly. The belief in one's own capacity to act shrinks. Over years, the gap between who someone could be and who they believe they can be becomes a canyon. Here's the counterintuitive turn. For many people, victim mentality isn't a failure of character. It's a protective strategy. If you never claim agency, you can never be blamed for outcomes. The armor of helplessness shields against the terror of accountability. This is the distinction that changes everything. The behavioral pattern, deflection, blame, passive suffering, sits on the surface. Beneath it lives a genuine, often frightened belief that trying will only expose you to more failure and more pain. Cognitive scientist Scott Barry Kaufman has shown how deeply our sense of self is constructed through narrative. The person who always plays the victim has often built their entire identity around a story of powerlessness, and dismantling it feels like self-destruction. Some people do deploy victimhood cynically, as a social tool. But behavioral science insists we hold both truths. Manipulation exists, and genuine learned helplessness also exists. Collapsing them into one judgment causes real harm. Repeated exposure to genuinely uncontrollable outcomes, chronic illness, poverty, abusive relationships, can produce the same neurological imprint as deliberately engineered helplessness. The nervous system doesn't always distinguish between real and perceived powerlessness. Which raises the question no one thinks to ask. If learned helplessness is learned, can it be unlearned? And if the belief in powerlessness is genuinely internalized, not performed, what does meaningful change actually require? Research points to a specific mechanism: Recovery from learned helplessness requires repeated, small experiences of genuine control, moments where effort produces a predictable outcome. The nervous system must be slowly recalibrated through evidence, not persuasion. Behavioral science has been applied to some of the most entrenched human challenges precisely because it understands this. You can't simply tell someone to believe in their agency. You must design environments where agency becomes experientially real. If you're watching someone who seems to perpetually suffer, behavioral science asks something difficult of you. Hold empathy and accountability simultaneously. Neither rescuing nor dismissing. Both are forms of abandonment. Every time a person is rescued from the natural consequences of their choices, the evidence for their own agency is erased. Compassion without accountability quietly confirms the belief that they can't manage outcomes, which is precisely the belief that needs challenging. Humanistic psychology frames the cost clearly. Self-actualization, the drive toward one's fullest potential, requires a foundational belief in personal agency. Victim mentality, whether rooted in manipulation or learned helplessness, blocks that drive at its source. Return to the assumption we started with, that victim mentality is simply manipulation. That assumption is, in most cases, wrong. Not because manipulation never occurs, it does, but because it's the exception, not the rule. And treating it as the default causes irreparable damage. For the person living inside this pattern, behavioral science offers a specific starting point. Identify one domain, however small, where outcome and effort visibly connect. Not a transformation, a single data point the nervous system can actually register. The environment must change alongside the individual. A person rebuilding their sense of agency inside a system that still rewards helplessness faces structural resistance that no amount of personal resolve can fully overcome. This isn't a rare psychological curiosity. Beneath the surface of ordinary daily life, in workplaces, relationships, families, learned helplessness operates quietly and pervasively. Most people carry some version of it in some domain of their lives. The harder implication sits here. To genuinely believe in someone's capacity for agency, including your own, means refusing the comfort of permanent victimhood as an identity. That refusal isn't cruelty. It is the deepest form of respect. Remember the question that opened this. What if someone has genuinely forgotten they ever had a choice? That forgetting isn't weakness. It's a learned response to a world that once made choice feel dangerous, pointless, or simply invisible. Victim mentality isn't a personality type. It's a map of old wounds. It tells you exactly where someone's nervous system learned that the world was uncontrollable, and therefore where the work of recalibration must begin. Here's what makes Seligman's 1967 findings even more striking in retrospect. In follow-up experiments, animals rendered helpless could recover, but only if they were physically guided through a successful escape. Passive exposure to the open door wasn't enough. The nervous system required direct, embodied experience of its own effectiveness. Telling someone they're capable, it turns out, changes almost nothing. Letting them feel it changes everything. The next time you catch yourself attributing a failure entirely to external forces, bad luck, other people, circumstances beyond your control, treat that moment as diagnostic data, not a verdict. Ask one question. What is the smallest variable here that I actually influence? You don't need to reclaim everything at once. You need one data point your nervous system can verify. That's where agency is rebuilt. Not in grand declarations, but in small, repeated acts of noticing that you were there, and that what you did mattered.